The first thing you noticed about Harlow and Birch Diner was the smell. Bacon grease and fresh coffee and something underneath both of those things, something older and more honest. The smell of a place that had been feeding working people since before the county road out front was paved, since before the executive neighborhoods 2 blocks north existed, since before anyone started calling this part of Caldwell County a transitional zone, which was a phrase that meant the money had not arrived yet but was expected, and the people already here were not part of the plan. It was a Tuesday morning in October, and the light came through the east-facing windows at that particular low angle that October mornings have, the kind of light that turns ordinary things golden for about 45 minutes before the sun climbs high enough to bleach everything back to its usual color. And in that golden window, the diner looked like something worth preserving. The cracked vinyl stools and the fluorescent hum and the coffee urns behind the counter and the handwritten specials on the chalkboard beside the register. All of it catching the light and holding it for just a moment before the morning moved on. Gloria Reyes had been working the Tuesday morning shift at Harlow and Birch for 19 years, and she knew this diner the way a person knows their own hands, without looking, without thinking, by feel and by memory, and by the particular knowledge that comes from being somewhere long enough that the place stops being a job and starts being a kind of home. And she moved through it now the way she always moved through it, setting tables, refilling coffee, keeping one eye on the door and one eye on the room, because that was what 19 years of waiting tables taught you, that the room was always telling you something, if you were paying attention. The customers that morning were the usual Tuesday mix, a white real estate developer at the window table with his phone pressed to his ear, talking about square footage and closing costs to someone who was apparently not listening closely enough, his coffee going cold beside him while he talked. 2 retired white men at the center table who had finished their eggs 20 minutes ago and showed no intention of leaving, lingering over empty plates the way people do when the diner is warmer than home, and there is nowhere in particular to be. A white construction foreman at the counter with mud-caked boots and a hard hat balanced on the stool beside him, eating his breakfast methodically and without looking up from the table. Officer Brett Lanning nodded at the foreman when he came in. He ordered coffee at the counter. He did not look at anyone else. Nobody watched the real estate developer. Nobody asked the retired men why they were still there. Nobody gave the construction foreman a second glance when he walked in with out-of-county plates on his truck and dust on every surface of his clothing. They were simply there the way people are simply there in diners on Tuesday mornings, unremarkable and unquestioned, taking up their space in the world without anyone demanding they explain themselves. At 6:58 a.m., a black luxury sedan with Capital District license plates pulled smoothly to the curb outside the front window. Senator Damon Carter stepped out of the car with the unhurried efficiency of a man who has learned to move through the world without wasting motion. Charcoal suit, polished shoes, a leather briefcase that had been with him through 4 legislative sessions and showed it in the worn edges and the scuff at the bottom left corner. A man of 51 who carried his years in his posture rather than on his face, upright and deliberate and completely at ease in his own skin in a way that some people found reassuring and other people found intolerable. And he chose the corner booth without hesitation because the window light was good and the corner was quiet, and he had exactly 90 minutes before the judiciary session at the state capitol required him to be somewhere else. Gloria set the coffee down before he asked for it. She had already read him, not his title, not his car, just him, the way he looked her in the eye when she approached, and said thank you like he meant it, which, in 19 years, she had learned to recognize as a thing that was rarer than it should be. He opened his briefcase. He spread the pages on the table beside the coffee. The top document was a marked-up draft of the Public Safety Integrity Act, covered in blue ink notes and tabbed margins, and the particular organized chaos of a document that has been worked on in cars and airports and hotel rooms and committee antechambers for 18 months, and near the top of the first page, circled twice in blue ink, was a single line that read, "Mandatory body camera preservation activated upon physical contact or detention in any public accommodation." He uncapped his pen. He picked up the coffee. He leaned back against the booth cushion, and for just a moment, in the golden October light coming through the east window, he was simply a man having breakfast, not a senator, not a chairman, not a symbol of anything at all. Just a man with good coffee and 90 minutes of quiet and work he believed in spread out on the table in front of him. That peace lasted 11 more minutes. To understand what happened next, you have to understand who was sitting in that corner booth, and not in the way that headlines understand it, not the title and the committee chairmanship and the 4 bills in 3 sessions, but in the way that matters, the way that tells you why a man makes the choices he makes when the pressure is on, and the easy path is right there in front of him. Damon Carter grew up in Fairfield Flats, which was the eastern pocket of Caldwell County, the part of the county that the people who wrote about Caldwell County as a success story tended to leave out of the narrative. A neighborhood where the streetlights went out every winter because the city's maintenance budget prioritized repairs north of the county line, and always had. Where the library closed at 5 o'clock because there was no funding for evening staff, and had been closing at 5 o'clock since before Damon was born. Where the schools had the same textbooks for 11 years because the district allocation formula had been written in 1987, and nobody with the power to change it had found a reason to do so. His mother, Evelyn Carter, cleaned office buildings downtown for 31 years. The same company, the same floors, waxing and mopping and emptying the trash cans of people who did not know her name. And in 31 years, she was never once offered a supervisory position, though she trained every woman who was promoted above her, trained them patiently and completely. And when Damon asked her once why she never said anything about it, she looked at him with the particular expression she reserved for questions she had already answered 1,000 times in her own head, and said, "Baby, I said plenty. The question is, who was listening?" His father, Raymond Carter, drove long-haul freight until his knees gave out at 53, a man who came home on weekends smelling of diesel and distance, and who sat at the kitchen table on Sunday mornings reading the newspaper with the focused attention of someone studying for a test he suspected was coming. And Raymond Carter had one lesson he returned to throughout Damon's childhood, not as a speech, but as a sentence said plainly and without drama, the way the truest things usually are. You will be stopped. You decide what you do while you're standing still. Damon was the child who noticed everything, the way certain teachers in Fairfield Flats called on the same students first, the way the gap between what the schools had and what the schools north of the county line had was invisible to people who had only ever seen one side of it, the way some people moved through the world without ever being asked to account for their presence in it. And he filed all of it away in the careful interior archive that would eventually become the mind of a very good attorney. He applied to 7 law schools. He was accepted to 3. He chose the one with the scholarship because there was no other way to go, and his mother drove him to orientation in the same car she had driven for 12 years, the one with the cracked dashboard and the passenger window that only rolled down halfway. And when she dropped him off, she held his face in both hands for a moment without saying anything, the way she did when words were not the right tool for what she was feeling. 11 years as a civil rights attorney, pattern of practice cases, wrongful detention suits, the kind of work that is never finished, because the underlying problem is never finished, only managed, only pushed back, only held at a distance by constant pressure. And in those 11 years, he won cases and lost cases, and learned things in courtrooms that you cannot learn anywhere else. Things about how evidence disappears, and how language is shaped to mean something different in a report than it meant in reality, and how a man can be perfectly innocent and still lose everything if no one is paying close enough attention at the right moment. The path to the Senate was not ambition, not in the conventional sense. It was a specific Tuesday afternoon in a conference room, sitting across from a mother whose son had been arrested on fabricated obstruction language and held for 9 months while the public defender system struggled to find room for his case, watching her hands shake as she described the day they came for him, watching her try to find words for something that had broken, something in her that had not finished breaking yet, and Damon sitting there with all of his legal knowledge and all of his courtroom experience, and the specific, sickening understanding that the law he had spent 11 years fighting inside could not reach far enough to have prevented what happened to her son. Because the protection did not exist yet, and the protection did not exist because no one with the power to build it had been angry enough for long enough to do the work. He ran for the Senate. He won by 6,000 votes, which in his district was not a comfortable margin, but was enough. And he chairs the Judiciary and Public Safety Committee, and he has introduced 4 bills in 3 sessions, and 3 of them have passed, and the 4th is the one spread across the table at Harlow and Birch Diner on a Tuesday morning in October, covered in blue ink and 18 months of work. The one that would do what nothing before it had managed to do. Protect the moment before the badge number matters. The moment when a person is just a person, and the law is supposed to be enough. He carries the weight of that purpose the way his father carried diesel fumes home on his jacket. Not as a burden exactly, more as evidence that he had been somewhere real, that the work was real, that the people waiting for the protection the bill would provide were real and had names and faces, and mothers who drove 12-year-old cars to orientation and held their children's faces in both hands without saying anything, because some things are too large for words. That is who was sitting in the corner booth at Harlow and Birch Diner at 6:58 in the morning with his coffee and his draft bill and 90 minutes of October quiet. That is who Officer Brett Lanning walked toward. Brett Lanning had been with the Caldwell County Police Department for 17 years, and in those 17 years he had developed a very specific understanding of how the world worked. An understanding built not from wisdom or experience in the truest sense, but from something more dangerous, from never having been wrong in any way that cost him anything, from 17 years of making calls that were questionable and having those calls absorbed by a system that was built, whether anyone said so out loud or not, to absorb exactly that kind of call and ask no further questions. He was 44 years old, thick through the shoulders, in the way of a man who had been athletic once, and was now something else, with a face that had settled into an expression of permanent, mild suspicion. The look of a man who had decided long ago that the world was hiding something from him, and had spent every day since looking for proof. And he moved through the diner that morning the way he moved through every space he occupied, with the particular physical confidence of someone who has never had to wonder whether he belonged there, who has never once walked into a room and felt the room shift around his presence in a way that was not welcoming. He grew up in the middle of Caldwell County, not the wealthy north, not the struggling east, the middle, the part that didn't have a story attached to it, where the houses were ordinary and the yards were ordinary and the expectations were ordinary, in that specific way that makes a certain kind of person very angry when they discover that ordinary is not the same thing as protected, that being in the middle means you have to look in 2 directions to figure out where you stand. And what Brett Lanning had taken from that particular geography of childhood was not humility, but its opposite. A rigid, unexamined sense that his place in the hierarchy was correct, and that anything that threatened it was a provocation. He had joined the force at 27 after a business degree that didn't take, and a marriage that lasted 14 months, and the badge had given him something the degree hadn't, something he hadn't known he was looking for until he found it. A defined position in a structure where the rules were visible, and the authority was explicit, and the power was something you could put on in the morning and feel against your chest all day. And that feeling had never gotten old, not in 17 years. Because the alternative was the feeling he'd had before the badge, which was no feeling in particular, which was the feeling of not mattering. And Brett Lanning had decided very early that he would do whatever was necessary to never feel that again. His personnel file told the story of a serviceable career, adequate evaluations. No major commendations, no major disciplinary actions. On the surface, but the citizen complaint history told a different story. The story that the file was designed to obscure rather than illuminate. 11 complaints over 17 years, 9 closed without action, 1 settled quietly with a non-disclosure agreement that cost the county $42,000 and cost Lanning nothing. 1 still technically under review, but sitting in an inactive queue where it had been sitting for 8 months, and would likely continue to sit until the statute of limitations made the question irrelevant. Every single complaint had come from residents of the eastern side of the county. Not one had come from the north. The pattern was not subtle if you were looking for it. The language in Lanning's field notes was not subtle either. Possible bulletin match appeared to be casing the area, refused identification, obstruction of investigation. Language that functioned as a skeleton key. Language that could justify a stop before a stop was justified. That could build the legal architecture of a detention after the detention had already begun. That could make a report read as procedure even when the procedure had been invented after the fact. He had used that language 11 times in the past 3 years, in addition to the 11 complaints, and not once had anyone in a position of authority asked him to explain the gap between what the language said and what the body cameras, when they were reviewed at all, actually showed. Because the reviews were rare, and the language was familiar, and the system trusted the pattern when the pattern was written clean. The Caldwell County Residential Burglary Bulletin had come through on his mobile terminal at 6:44 that morning. A series of rear-entry break-ins in the Pinecrest Executive Neighborhood white cargo van. 2 male suspects seen on private security camera footage after 2 a.m. No further description available. And Lanning had not opened it because he was finishing his coffee, and because the bulletin did not seem urgent, and because the morning had been quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that Lanning had never learned to be comfortable with, that he filled by scanning, by looking for the thing that was out of place, by doing the work that 17 years had convinced him was the most important work there was, which was identifying the people who didn't belong before they had a chance to prove they did. He saw Damon's car first, Capital District plates, luxury sedan parked cleanly at the curb outside the diner, the kind of car that belonged in the Pinecrest neighborhood 2 blocks north and not on this block. And the incongruity of it caught in his mind the way incongruities always caught in Lanning's mind, flagged and filed and held for further examination. Then he looked through the window and saw Damon in the corner booth. What happened in Brett Lanning's mind in the 4 seconds between seeing Damon and setting down his coffee cup was not a conscious thought, not a reasoning process, not an evaluation of observed conduct against any articulable legal standard. It was something older and faster than thought, a pattern recognition that had been built over 17 years of unchallenged assumptions. A reflex that dressed itself in the language of professional instinct, because professional instinct was what it was allowed to call itself. And in those 4 seconds, the entire weight of those 17 years came down on one side of a scale that Lanning didn't know he was holding. And the result was a foregone conclusion before he had consciously decided anything. He set down his coffee cup. He adjusted the radio on his shoulder. He did not open the bulletin on his mobile terminal. Frank, the diner manager, was behind the counter when he saw the change in Lanning's face. And he had seen that change before, in this diner and in this county, and in other places. And he took 2 steps toward the front and then stopped, because he had also learned over the years what happened to people who stepped forward in that moment. And the learning had not made him brave, it had made him still. And he stood behind the counter with his hands on the register and did not move. Gloria noticed it too, the specific shift in the room's atmosphere that happens when something is about to go wrong. That drop in ambient sound that is not silence, but is the thing just before silence. Every person in the room registering something without being able to name it. And she turned from the coffee station with a towel in her hand and watched Lanning walk toward the corner booth with the deliberate proprietary stride of a man who has decided that the space he is moving through belongs to him. And something in the back of her mind, in the part that had been watching diners and people and the space between them for 19 years, said, "Not again." Lanning stopped beside the booth. He looked down at Damon, at the suit, at the briefcase, at the papers spread on the table, at the coffee cup, at the pen. And what he saw was not what was there, but what he had already decided was there, which is the most dangerous kind of seeing there is. He said, "Morning." And everything that followed was already in motion. The exchange began the way these things always begin when one person has already made up their mind, with the surface vocabulary of procedure covering something that was not procedure at all, with questions that were not questions but demands, wearing the grammatical shape of questions, with a body positioned to communicate authority before a single word had been spoken. Lanning stood beside the booth with one hand near his belt, and his weight settled back on his heels in the particular posture of a man who is waiting for the other person to make an error. And he looked at Damon the way he had looked at 11 other people in Field's notes that said, "Possible bulletin match," with the flat, cataloging attention of someone who has already found what they were looking for, and is now building the justification for having found it. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," Officer Damon said, and his voice was even and unhurried, and completely without the particular quality of nervous deference that Lanning was accustomed to hearing from people he approached this way. And the absence of that quality registered in Lanning as something requiring correction. Lanning glanced at the papers on the table, then at the car through the front window, and the glance was not investigative, it was performative. The gesture of a man establishing dominance by demonstrating that he notices things, that he is the one with the authority to notice things. "That yours?" he asked, meaning the car. "Yes," Damon said. "What brings you to Maple and Iron breakfast?" The answer was correct and complete and offered without elaboration, and it landed on Lanning like a small refusal. Because the correct answer, delivered without apology or explanation, was not the answer he had been conditioning people to give him for 17 years. The correct answer, with apology attached, with the nervous over-explanation that said, "I know you have the power here, and I am acknowledging it," the answer that confirmed the hierarchy. And Damon's calm, simple, complete answer confirmed nothing of the kind. "We've had some burglary activity in the executive neighborhoods," Lanning said, and this was the first fabrication. Not a lie exactly in the way that a specific untrue statement is a lie, but a fabrication in the deeper sense, an implication that the burglary bulletin was relevant to this stop, that it had been read, that it described something that connected to the man sitting in this booth. None of which was true. None of which Lanning could have known because the bulletin was sitting unread on his mobile terminal 600 yards away in the parking lot. "What observed conduct connects me to that bulletin?" Damon asked. The question was precise, and it was devastating in its precision because it asked for the thing that did not exist, the actual articulable fact that justified what Lanning was doing. And Lanning's jaw moved once, the small, involuntary adjustment of a man whose script has been interrupted. And then he said, "I'm going to need identification." "For what legal purpose?" "This is an active investigation." The diner went quiet around them in that particular way, not the sudden silence of a dramatic event, but the gradual spreading quiet of a room full of people who have all individually decided that what is happening requires their attention and their discretion simultaneously, each person going still in their own way. The retired men at the center table no longer speaking, the real estate developer's phone hand moving slowly down from his ear, Gloria at the coffee station with the towel held against her chest. And then Lanning put his palm flat on the table, and the coffee cup jumped, and the dark liquid slid over the rim and across the saucer and spread across the front page of the draft bill. And it moved in the slow, inevitable way that liquid moves on paper, soaking into the fibers, spreading past the margins, reaching the circled line and moving through it. And Damon watched it happen and said nothing because there was nothing to say. That the body camera on Lanning's chest was not already recording better than words could. "Stand up," Lanning said. Damon looked at the stain. He looked at Lanning. And then he said in a voice that was so steady it was almost quiet, "Am I being detained?" "You are now. I will comply with physical commands under protest." He stood up slowly, his hands open and visible at his sides, his posture perfectly upright. And what crossed his face in that moment was not fear and not anger, but something more controlled and more purposeful than either of those things. The expression of a man who has decided exactly what this moment is for. What happened in the 4 seconds between Lanning saying, "You are now," and Damon saying, "I will comply," was not visible on any camera and was not audible on any recording. But it was the most consequential 4 seconds of the entire morning, Because it was the 4 seconds in which Damon Carter made the choice that would determine what the next 6 months of his life, and the next several years of Brett Lanning's life, and the next 14 months of Raymond Carver's life would look like. There was a credential in the inside pocket of his suit jacket. He could feel the weight of it against his ribs, the way he had felt it every morning for 3 years. The particular density of the state Senate ID with the gold seal and his name, and the words Chair, Judiciary, and Public Safety Committee printed below the photograph. And the credential was approximately 8 inches from his hand, and retrieving it would take 4 seconds, and showing it would take 2 seconds more, and Lanning would take 1 step back, and then another, and his face would go through the sequence Damon had watched on other faces in other contexts. The flash of recognition, and then the calculation of exposure, and then the rapid construction of an explanation, and the whole encounter would be over in 60 seconds. He knew this. He knew it with the precision of a man who has watched that exact sequence happen in depositions and courtrooms and police station lobbies, who has been on the other side of the badge reveal enough times to know every beat of what follows it, who could have predicted to within 15 seconds how the next minute would unfold if he reached into that pocket. He did not reach. Not because he was afraid. Fear was not what this was. Not because he was making a point in some performative sense. He had never had patience for performance over substance, and this was not performance. What this was, in the interior language of a man who had spent 20 years thinking carefully about exactly these situations, was a recognition that the record that mattered was not the record that would exist if he showed his credential right now. He thought about Marcus Tibbs, 23 years old from Fairfield Flats, arrested 18 months ago on obstruction, language that the public defender had not been able to crack in time. The body camera footage already overwritten by the time the case got reviewed. No credential in his pocket, no committee chairmanship. Nothing but his own word against a field note written in the language of professional procedure and the closed case approval of a sergeant who had trusted the pattern without reading the source document. He thought about the mother in the conference room with her shaking hands. He thought about the circled line on the draft bill now covered in coffee. And he thought about what the line was designed to protect, not senators, not people with credentials, but the moment before any of that, the moment when a person is simply a person, and the law is supposed to be enough. He thought, if I reach for this credential, the camera records a stop that ended correctly. It records Lanning seeing the badge and backing down, which means it records the system working. And the system did not work. The system produced this moment, this table, this palm print on the edge of the booth, and the coffee spreading across the pages. And if he reaches into that pocket, the record will say the system worked, because one person in this booth had the right piece of identification, and what he has spent 3 years trying to build is a law that protects the people who don't. He needed the sequence intact. He needed every step documented in the order it occurred, the unread bulletin, the fabricated match, the palm on the table, the order to stand, the compliance stated clearly for the camera. The moment the credential would have been shown, and wasn't, because the bill he was carrying in that briefcase was built on exactly this sequence, and the sequence needed to be real and complete and uninterrupted to be the thing it needed to be. He was not choosing this for himself. He was choosing it for Marcus Tibbs, for the 23-year-old who made this same drive without a credential in his pocket, for every person the law was supposed to protect before they had to prove they deserved protection. So he kept his hands open. He kept his voice level. He said clearly and with complete composure for the body camera blinking on Lanning's chest. The bulletin was unread before this contact. My hands are visible. I am complying under protest. This detention is without observed cause. He said it once clearly in full sentences the way he had learned in 20 years of courtrooms to say things that needed to be on the record. Not for the room, not for Lanning, but for the camera, for the timestamp, for the chain of events that would need to be readable in sequence by someone who had not been in the diner to see it happen. Then he stood up. Lanning moved behind him. The cuffs closed tight enough to be immediately uncomfortable. Tight enough that Gloria, watching from the coffee station, looked away. I am not resisting, Damon said. The bulletin was unread before detention. My hands were visible throughout. I am complying under duress. His voice was steady. It would remain steady for the next 47 minutes. It would remain steady because he had decided what this morning was for. And what it was for required him to be the calmest person in every room he entered. And Damon Carter had spent his whole life preparing without knowing it for exactly that requirement. Gloria Reyes stood at the coffee station with the towel against her chest and watched Officer Brett Lanning walk Damon Carter through the diner toward the front door. And what she felt in that moment was not surprise, which was perhaps the most terrible thing about it. Not surprise because she had been watching this particular kind of thing happen in this particular diner and in this county and in places before this county for 53 years of her life. And the part of her that might once have been surprised by it had been replaced long ago by something harder and more tired and more alert. She had seen it happen to younger men who came in for the early breakfast special before a shift, who left their food getting cold on the table and didn't come back, whose names she sometimes heard about later and sometimes didn't. And she had watched it happen the way people watch things happen, when the gap between what they can do and what needs doing is too wide to cross, with the particular helpless attention of a witness who has no authority and knows it. The white real estate developer had not looked up from his phone. The retired men at the center table had gone very still in the way of people who are watching something they have decided not to see. Frank had his hands on the register and was looking at a point somewhere between the counter and the door that was not anything at all. She watched Damon walk through the diner, past the center table, past the counter, past the chalkboard specials, his hands cuffed behind him and his posture absolutely straight, his shoulders back, his chin level, moving with a dignity that was not performance but was simply what he was, what he had been before Lanning walked in, and what he remained now, unchanged, as if Lanning's authority had not touched the essential thing, had only touched the surface. And she thought, I have seen that walk before. I have seen that walk on men who didn't survive the morning. She picked up her phone before she had consciously decided to. The camera opened. She held it at the counter's edge, still quiet, and she recorded the last 30 feet of Damon's passage through Harlow and Birch Diner through the front window glass across the parking lot to the cruiser. Steady footage, clear audio from the diner's morning ambient, a record of exactly what happened in the order it happened. When the door closed behind them and the sound of the morning came back in, muffled and ordinary, Gloria lowered her phone and stood for a moment in the silence that the room had become. Then she did the second thing. She went to the register and pulled the printed order ticket from the tape, paid by card at 6:59 a.m. The timestamp exact. The transaction complete. A paying customer's receipt from a man who had not finished his breakfast. And she slid it into a clear takeout sleeve from the counter and set it under the register where it would not be touched or moved or thrown away. She did this without being asked, without knowing for certain that it would matter, on the basis of 19 years of watching what happened when there was something to show and what happened when there wasn't. And the difference in her experience was often exactly this: the small, preserved thing. The receipt, the photograph, the piece of paper that someone thought to keep because it seemed like the kind of thing that might matter later. Frank looked at her from the other end of the counter. Neither of them said the thing they were both thinking. Gloria picked up her phone. She opened her contacts. She found the number she was looking for, a number she had never used before, had kept for the same reason people kept certain things against the day when the distance between what they could do and what needed doing might narrow enough to matter. And she made the call. The line rang twice before someone answered. She said, "This is Gloria Reyes at Harlow and Birch. I need you to come to the station." The October morning outside the diner was clear and cold, the kind of cold that arrives in Caldwell County before people are ready for it, carrying the smell of dry leaves and highway exhaust, and the particular clarity of air that hasn't been warmed yet by the day's traffic. And in that clear, cold morning light, the parking lot of Harlow and Birch looked very ordinary. 3 cars, a pickup truck, the black luxury sedan at the curb. And what was happening in it looked very ordinary too, if you did not know what to look for. If you did not know that the man in the charcoal suit standing against the cruiser with his hands behind his back had been a paying customer 90 seconds ago. Officer Marcus Webb was 26 years old and 8 months out of the academy assigned to the Caldwell County PD's Eastern Sector, and he arrived in response to Lanning's radio check in his own cruiser 3 minutes after the call, pulling into the lot with the careful, deliberate movements of a man who was still learning what his presence in a situation meant and who had not yet decided how much of that learning to trust. He was not corrupt. He was not cruel. He was young and uncertain, and trying to read a situation that his training had prepared him for in theory and not at all prepared him for in practice. And what the situation looked like from his angle. A veteran officer with a civilian in custody activated a pattern that the academy had installed in him, which was that you back your partner first and ask questions in the report. And that pattern was already running before he got out of the car. His mobile data terminal showed the bulletin in full. He had opened it when the call came through, which was procedure, which was what you were supposed to do. And he read it in the 30 seconds before he got out of the car, and what it said was this: white cargo van, 2 male suspects, rear entry break-ins after 2 a.m. And he looked at Damon against the cruiser, at the charcoal suit and the polished shoes and the luxury sedan at the curb, and the arithmetic did not add up. He approached carefully. He looked at Lanning. He said quietly so only Lanning could hear Brett, "The bulletin says, white van." Lanning did not answer. He was already directing Webb toward Damon's jacket pocket. Webb retrieved the wallet. This was procedural. This was the kind of thing you did. You retrieved the identification from the detained individual's pocket with care and with your body camera rolling. And he opened it. And what he found inside was not a driver's license. He found the state senate credential. He read it slowly, in the way of someone who wants to be certain they are reading what they think they are reading. The gold seal of the state, the formal identification card, the photograph. And below the photograph, in clean black type, Senator Damon Carter, Chair, Judiciary and Public Safety Committee. The photograph matched the man standing against the cruiser. Webb's hand tightened on the leather. He stood in the parking lot of Harlow and Birch Diner at 7:29 in the morning, holding a state senate credential belonging to the chair of the Judiciary and Public Safety Committee, and his body camera was running, and Lanning was 6 feet away, and the moment to stop what was happening was approximately right now. And what Webb felt in that moment was the specific, nauseating vertigo of a person standing at the exact point where the right thing and the safe thing diverge into 2 completely different directions. "Travis," he said, not loud. He said it the way you say a name when you are hoping the name alone will communicate the thing that is too complicated to say out loud. Lanning held out his hand. Webb looked at the credential. He looked at Damon. He looked at Lanning's hand. He put the credential in Lanning's palm, and Lanning, without reading it, without opening it, without looking at the name or the photograph or the gold seal that should have stopped everything, put it in his own vest pocket. He did this with the smooth, practiced motion of a man who has learned to absorb complications without reacting to them, who has learned over 17 years that the forward direction is always safer than the backward one, and whose understanding of safe had been so badly warped by 17 years of impunity that he genuinely could not read the room he was standing in. Webb stood in the parking lot with nothing in his hand where the credential had been, watching Lanning turn back toward the cruiser and the moment that had been available to him. The moment that was in fact still technically available, if he moved in the next 5 seconds, began to close, the way moments close. Not dramatically, not with a sound, but with the quiet irreversibility of time moving forward while he stood still. He did not move. Later he would have to explain why. Later he would say because he was senior and I was afraid he would bury me. And that answer would be true, and it would not be enough, and he would know both things simultaneously, and carry them both, which was its own kind of sentence. The cruiser door opened. Damon was guided into the back seat. The door closed. Webb stood alone in the parking lot in the October morning and watched the cruiser pull out, and he was already thinking about what he was going to do next. And the thinking had the specific quality of a decision arriving, rather than a decision being made. which meant it had been made somewhere below the surface while he was still standing still. The drive from Harlow and Birch Diner to the Oakmont station took 9 minutes on the county road, and Brett Lanning drove at 4 miles per hour over the limit with the particular aggressive efficiency of a man who is moving away from a problem rather than toward a solution. And in the back seat of the cruiser, Damon Carter sat upright against the hard plastic partition with his hands cuffed behind him and his suit jacket pulling across his shoulders. And the particular combination of physical discomfort and absolute interior composure that had been his condition for the last 22 minutes. The back seat of a police cruiser smells like industrial cleaning solution, and something underneath it that cleaning solution cannot reach. Something that is the accumulated residue of every frightened person who has ever sat in this exact seat, and the partition between the front and back is plexiglass, scratched to opacity at eye level from years of contact. And the window does not open, and the seat is molded plastic with no cushion, and the whole space is designed, whether by intention or by accumulated indifference, to remind whoever is sitting in it that they are not in control of what happens next. Damon was aware of all of this, and it did not move him. Not because he was indifferent to discomfort, but because the part of him that was currently active was not the part that responded to discomfort. It was the part that responded to information, that took in everything it was given and organized it, and held it in sequence against the moment when sequence would matter. He thought of his father's voice. "You decide what you do while you're standing still." And he thought, "I am deciding." He faced the body camera mounted on Lanning's dashboard, and he spoke clearly in the unhurried cadence of a man making a legal record, without anger, without volume, without anything that could be characterized as agitation or resistance. The bulletin was unread at first contact. The stated bulletin match was created after detention began. My wallet was taken after my identity was confirmed by the attending officer. I am in this vehicle without having committed any observable offense and without a legitimate legal basis for this detention. He said each of these things once in order with full sentences and no repetition, and when he finished, he was quiet. Lanning told him to stop talking. "I am making a record," Damon said. "You are welcome to do the same." Lanning said louder, "I said stop talking." "No," Damon said. And then he continued. He was not doing this to antagonize Lanning. Antagonizing Lanning was not the objective, not even close to the objective. He was doing it because the body camera required content to be useful, because a recording of silence was not the same as a recording of facts stated in sequence, and because every word he said now was a word that would exist in the timestamp record of this morning's events, in the order the events had actually occurred. And that order was the thing he was building patiently and completely in the back seat of a cruiser on a county road in October. He looked out the window as they drove the county road, the strip of commercial buildings that turn onto the highway, access. The neighborhoods shifting north, getting larger and more expensive as the station approached. And what he was looking at, not with his eyes, but with the part of him that kept track of these things, was the distance between this neighborhood and the diner's neighborhood. And the distance between this neighborhood and Fairfield Flats, and the fact that those distances were not measured in miles. He thought about Marcus Tibbs. He thought about what the morning had cost Tibbs, not just the 9 months of custody, but the job lost, and the apartment lost, and the girlfriend who had stopped coming to visitation, and the look on his mother's face in the conference room with her shaking hands. And he thought about what the morning had cost Tibbs, because the record was not intact, because the body camera footage had been overwritten, because there was nothing left to show in the sequence it had actually happened. He thought this time the sequence is intact. Every step is on the record. Lanning's body camera has been running since he walked into the diner. The mobile terminal will show the timestamp of the bulletin being opened. The diner's point-of-sale system has the receipt time-stamped at 6:59 a.m. Gloria Reyes has whatever she recorded on her phone. The cuff marks on his wrists are already visible and will be visible for hours. The sequence is intact. The record is real. What happens next depends on who is paying attention. He turned his head slightly so the cuff marks on his left wrist faced the rear-facing camera mounted in the partition, and he stated quietly and without inflection, "I am noting for the record that the restraints applied by Officer Lanning are tight enough to restrict circulation. The marks are visible and will be photographically documented." Lanning hit the radio. "Oakmont booking, this is Unit 14. Inbound with 1 ETA 4 minutes. Obstruction, failure to identify." The radio crackled in acknowledgement. Damon sat back. He looked at the October sky through the scratched window glass, the particular pale blue of an October morning before the clouds come in, and he thought about Evelyn Carter driving him to orientation in the car with the cracked dashboard, and the way she had held his face in both hands at the drop-off circle without saying anything. And what she had not said with words was, "I have given you everything I have, and I need it to have been enough." It was enough, he thought. Whatever happens in the next hour, it is enough. The cruiser turned into the station's rear entrance. The Sally Port door rose. The morning disappeared behind it. The Oakmont station's booking area smelled like burnt coffee and fluorescent light, and the particular institutional smell of a building that has been processing human beings through its procedures for long enough that the procedures have become the building's personality. And Sergeant Harold Price had been behind the booking desk for so long that he and the building had developed the same personality, efficient, economical, accustomed to receiving the world in certain formats and processing it accordingly, without asking too many questions about the gap between the format and the reality underneath it. He was 58 years old and 3 years from retirement, and his career had been built on a quality that he had always thought of as pragmatism, and was only now in the clarity of what was about to happen to him, beginning to understand might have been something else. Something more like the willingness to let other people's certainty substitute for his own judgment, to sign his name below the line where the narrative was already written. To trust the pattern, because trusting the pattern was faster and less complicated than verifying the source. He looked up when Lanning brought Damon through the booking entrance, and he saw the suit first and then the cuffs. And then the particular way Damon was standing, not the way people usually stood at the booking desk, which was some version of defeat, or defiance, or the collapsed posture of someone who had been processed before. But perfectly straight, shoulders back, hands visible where the cuffs allowed them, with the composed and watchful expression of a man who was paying very close attention to everything around him. Price's pen stopped chewing itself. Lanning recited the charges in the flat, familiar cadence of a man reciting something he has said many times before. Obstruction of investigation. Failure to identify during active bulletin inquiry. Possible bulletin match. He said this without looking at Damon and without varying his tone, and Price began to type, because that was what Price did. He began to type when the officer spoke, because the officer had the information, and Price had the form. And that was how the division of labor had worked for 30 years. Damon turned his wrists slightly so the marks left by the cuffs faced the booking desk's mounted camera, deliberately quietly, without comment, and then he said his name without being asked and without inflection. Damon Carter. I want it noted that the arresting officer had not read the referenced bulletin before contact was initiated. Price looked up. It was the voice that did it, not the words. Though the words were unusual, but the voice. The complete absence of the register that the booking desk was used to receiving. The absence of fear or belligerence, or the particular flattened exhaustion of someone who has been through this before and expects nothing good. And Price looked at the man in the charcoal suit with the cuff marks on his wrists and felt the first small twitch of professional unease. He asked, "Did you verify the bulletin before cuffs?" Lanning began the pivot to procedural language. He refused identification during the course of, and Price said with the flat patience of a man who has heard this specific sentence complete itself in multiple directions and knows which direction is true. "That is not what I asked." The Sally Port door opened before Lanning could answer. Officer Marcus Webb came through it, breathing harder than the short walk should have required, and behind him, moving with the purposeful efficiency of someone who had driven to a place they had never expected to need to go, was Gloria Reyes, still in her apron with the Harlow and Birch logo on the front, the printed order ticket in a clear sleeve in her left hand and her phone in her right. And behind her, 2 steps back, was Frank, the diner manager, who had followed without being asked because he had finally decided, standing at the register after the cruiser pulled out, that the distance had narrowed enough. Webb looked at Price and said, "Don't book him yet." The room went still in the specific way of a room that has just been interrupted in the middle of a process that was moving toward a conclusion, every person in it recalibrating their position relative to what had just been said. Price looked at Webb. He looked at Gloria. He looked at Frank. He looked at the clear sleeve with the receipt inside it visible through the plastic, the timestamp readable even from the distance of the booking desk. 6:59 a.m., before any of the rest of this morning's events had occurred. He looked at Lanning. Lanning had turned around slowly, the way a man turns when he is managing his body language, and the management is costing him something. And his face had the controlled flatness of a person applying significant effort to appearing unconcerned. Webb said, "The bulletin is a white cargo van, 2 male suspects, rear entry break-ins after 2 a.m. Senator Carter was a paying customer inside the diner at 6:59 a.m. I have the bulletin open on my terminal. The criteria do not match." He said the word senator without knowing exactly what it would do to the room. Said it because it was the accurate word, the word on the credential he had read in the parking lot. And it did what accurate words do when they arrive in rooms where something inaccurate has been building. It changed the temperature. Price stopped typing. He looked at the word he had already typed. Possible bulletin match. And he looked at the receipt in the clear sleeve, and at the timestamp, and at Webb's face, and he felt the specific, delayed weight of 30 years of trusting the pattern, settling on him all at once, not as accusation, but as the simple recognition that the pattern was not the same thing as the truth. And he had been signing his name below the pattern for 3 decades without always looking at what was underneath it. Captain Laura Voss came through the inner door 40 seconds later, jacket not yet fully buttoned, and her eyes moved through the room with the practiced assessment of a commanding officer arriving at a situation whose parameters she has not yet been given. To the cuff marks on Damon's wrists, to Lanning's controlled face, to Webb standing with his hands at his sides, to Gloria holding the receipt, to Price sitting very still at the keyboard. She said Senator Greer. Then she corrected herself immediately. "Senator Carter, I apologize." "Not here," Damon said, and his voice was still unhurried. "We'll clear it here." Marcus Webb stood in the middle of the Oakmont Station booking room and felt every eye in it find him. And what he felt in his body was the residual adrenaline of a decision made too slowly in a parking lot, and then made correctly in a booking room, and the combination of those 2 things, the delay and the correction, was going to define the next several years of his professional life, in ways he could not yet fully see, but was already beginning to feel. He had said, "Don't book him yet," because it was the accurate statement of what needed to happen. And he had said senator because it was the accurate word. And he had named the bulletin mismatch because the mismatch was real and documented, and sitting on his mobile terminal with a timestamp that predated the entire stop. And all of these things were true, and all of them were necessary, and none of them required courage. Exactly what they required was the specific willingness to say the true thing in the room where the true thing was inconvenient, which is a different thing from courage, but feels in the moment very similar. He named the bulletin mismatch in full and in sequence, and when he was finished, the room had the particular quality of a space in which something has been said that cannot be unsaid, the air pressure of irreversibility. And Price had stopped typing, and Lanning had gone very still, and Gloria was standing at the edge of the booking area with the clear sleeve in her hand, looking at Price in the way of a person who has brought the one thing they were asked to bring, and is waiting to see if it will be enough. Damon placed his requests into the room with the calm efficiency of a man filing motions, not as demands as documentation. Lock the body camera export from Officer Lanning's chest unit. Preserve the mobile terminal. Audit for Unit 14. Hold the diner security footage and the point-of-sale records and all CAD dispatch entries without overwrite. Preserve the booking desk camera footage from the moment of entry. "If any of those records are altered before the state preservation order arrives," he said, and his voice carried the specific weight of a man who knows the law he is citing from the inside rather than from a textbook, "it becomes a separate case with its own federal considerations." PBA counsel Martin Doyle came through the side door at that moment with a folder under his arm, already speaking before he had fully entered the room. And Damon looked at him with the patient expression of a man who has encountered Martin Doyle's folder in other rooms and knows exactly what is inside it, and said, "Counsel, the preservation order will be served in approximately 20 minutes. Anything you do with that folder before it arrives will be reviewed in sequence." Doyle stopped. He looked at the man in the stained charcoal suit with the cuff marks on his wrists, and something shifted in his face. The specific recalibration of a person who has walked into a room expecting one set of conditions and found another. Nobody had told him who the man in the stained suit was. Captain Voss made the calls that needed to be made in the order they needed to be made, and Lanning took one step backward, just one, barely visible, barely a step at all, more a shift of weight, and the step was the most honest thing he had done all morning, because it was his body telling the truth that his face was still trying to manage the truth, that the ground he thought he was standing on was not what he had believed it was. Webb watched him take that step, and for the first time since the parking lot he stopped being afraid of him. Attorney General Simon Howell arrived at the Oakmont station at 7:56 a.m., 33 minutes after the cruiser had pulled out of Harlow and Birch's parking lot, which is a remarkably short time for the state's chief law enforcement officer to appear in a county booking room. And the shortness of that time told its own story about what had been said in what phone calls. And he came without drama, without raised voices, without the kind of theatrical authority that announces itself before it arrives. Just a man in a dark suit with a state evidence technician and a chain of custody form and a preservation order that had been processed before he left his office, covering every digital record in the building. He was introduced to Damon not by his title, but by the fact that he had walked to Damon first before acknowledging anyone else in the room, and shook his hand in the direct and deliberate way of a man who is making a statement about whose account he is beginning from. The briefing room was commandeered a conference table, chairs pulled from the hallway. The body camera footage accessed through the department's digital evidence system and loaded onto the screen at the room's far wall, and the people who assembled around that table were Howell, Captain Voss, Sergeant Price, Lanning, Webb, Doyle, who had lost most of his color in the past 20 minutes, and Damon, who sat at the end of the table with his hands folded in front of him and the coffee stain on his jacket drying to a hard brown edge. Doyle attempted to speak at the beginning, something about his client's cooperation and the administrative nature of the matter, and Damon said without volume or heat, "Counsel, the state preservation order is already in place. Anything you say about cooperation is welcome. Anything you say about the nature of this matter is premature." Doyle sat down. Howell did not look at anyone in particular when he said, "Let's start from the beginning." He looked at the camera mounted in the corner of the room which had been recording since his arrival, and then he looked at the screen, and the footage began to play. The body camera record from the moment Officer Brett Lanning's unit had entered Harlow and Birch Diner, activating the pre-event buffer that the department's Axon system maintained on all active units, beginning 4 minutes and 18 seconds before the first contact with Damon. The diner looked different on camera than it had looked in memory, smaller and brighter, the fluorescent light evening everything out, the angles slightly compressed by the lens. But the essential things were all there: the corner booth, the coffee, the papers, the circled line visible in the frame, the charcoal suit, both hands on the table. The room was very quiet. Lanning was looking at the table. Price had his hands folded in front of him in a way that was almost identical to Damon's, which was probably coincidence. Webb was watching the screen with the specific attention of a person who has been in a situation and is now watching themselves be in it again from the outside, which is a particular kind of difficult. The footage began. What the room watched unfold on the screen was not a story. It was a sequence, a documented chain of events that existed independent of any interpretation or characterization anyone in the room might wish to apply to it. And sequences of that kind have a specific quality that courtroom language and field note language do not have, which is that they cannot be edited after the fact, cannot be supplemented with details that were not present when the recording was made, cannot be made to say something other than what they say. The footage opened on the diner interior, the fluorescent warmth of it, the morning customers, the particular stillness of a room doing its ordinary business. And then Lanning's angle moved toward the corner booth, and the table came into frame. And what the camera saw on that table was what Damon had arranged there before the morning went wrong. The draft bill, the marked margins, the blue ink, the coffee still steaming in the cup, and near the top of the visible page, just legible in the camera's resolution, the circled line. The mobile terminal audit appeared on a second screen loaded by the state evidence technician from the department's access records, a timeline of every interaction with Lanning's unit from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. that morning, time-stamped to the second, and the timestamp that mattered was visible and unambiguous. The Caldwell County Residential Burglary Bulletin had been received on Lanning's terminal at 6:44 a.m. It had been opened for the first time at 7:31 a.m., 7 minutes after the cuffs had been applied. Howell said nothing. He let the timestamps speak. The coffee spill happened on camera in a way that was worse than Damon's description of it. The camera angle caught the pressure of Lanning's palm on the table before his hand lifted, the deliberate downward weight of it. The cup moving, not because it was jostled, but because the table moved and the liquid spread in real time across the papers with the slow inevitability that liquid has on paper. And the camera held on the stain for 3 full seconds before the angle shifted. And in those 3 seconds, the circled line disappeared under the coffee. The point-of-sale receipt was displayed on a third screen, paid by card 6:59 a.m. before first contact, and Gloria Reyes, seated against the wall at Damon's request as a material witness, said nothing, because the receipt said everything that needed saying. The parking lot audio captured things the diner footage had not captured, things that had been said in the particular quiet of a parking lot at 7:28 in the morning, with only the highway and the October air for ambient sound, and 2 of those things were important. Webb's voice, low and careful, saying the bulletin doesn't match, and Lanning's response, the sound of the wallet being pocketed without being read. But it was the third recording the audio from the body camera in the parking lot, approximately 2 minutes after the pocketing of the wallet, that changed the temperature of the room so completely that it seemed for a moment as if the ventilation had stopped. Lanning's voice, recorded without his awareness of its significance, speaking to Webb in the particular low tone of a man who believes he is speaking only between colleagues. Add the bulletin language. Judges trust the pattern when we write it clean. Howell paused the footage. The room did not breathe. In the silence that followed, the only sound was the faint mechanical hum of the projector maintaining its image on the wall. And on the wall, the paused frame showed Lanning's profile in the parking lot light, his mouth still slightly open from the last syllable of the sentence that had just ended his career. Howell looked at Captain Voss with the patient, unhurried expression of a man who is asking a question he already knows part of the answer to. What pattern? Voss did not answer quickly enough. Webb answered not to implicate anyone, not as an act of aggression, but because the truth was already present in the room, in the form of a recorded sentence, and the only question was whether the people around the table were going to acknowledge it, or perform uncertainty about something that was not uncertain. It's not the first time I've heard that phrase, he said. 6 weeks ago, during a traffic stop, I was observing. From Officer Lanning. Yes, sir. And you said nothing at the time? No, sir. Howell looked at him for a moment, and what passed between them in that look was not unkind, but it was exact the acknowledgement that what Webb had just done was necessary, and that it had arrived later than it should have, and that both of those things were true simultaneously, and neither canceled the other. We'll come back to that, Howell said. He opened a second folder. The tab was handwritten. It read, Raymond Carver, Caldwell County closed. He set it on the table and looked at Lanning for the first time since the footage had begun, not with anger, not with the theatrical condemnation that moments like this invite, but with the steady assessing look of a man who is adding a number to a column that has been building for a while. "Tell me about this file," he said. Lanning said nothing. Price at the other end of the table recognized the name. He had signed the booking approval on Raymond Carver's case 14 months ago, above a note that said, "Bulletin language verified," and he had not verified it. He had trusted Lanning, and Lanning had trusted the pattern. And the pattern had cost a 23-year-old from Fairfield Flats 14 months of his life, and everything that went with them. Price looked at his own hands. Damon looked at the folder and said nothing. But what crossed his face in that moment was not triumph and not satisfaction. It was something quieter and heavier than both of those things. The specific expression of a person who has been trying to prove something for a very long time and has just watched it prove itself. The footage had been paused for almost 3 minutes, the image still holding on Lanning's profile in the parking lot light, with his mouth open mid-sentence when Lanning finally began to speak. He used the language he had been using for 17 years, the language that had worked for 17 years. The language that had been built and refined through 11 complaint reviews and 9 closed cases and 1 settlement and 17 years of field notes written. Clean. He said the bulletin was contextually relevant. He said the situation had escalated. He said the stop was based on pattern recognition developed over a long career. He said he had been acting on professional instinct and years of experience in exactly this kind of neighborhood inquiry. He said these things with the smooth, rehearsed quality of language that has been deployed many times before and has never cost its speaker anything. And what was different about this room, different from every other room where this language had worked, was that this room contained a recording that existed prior to and independent of the language. A recording that did not have a version, only a sequence, and the sequence and the language were not the same thing. He stopped speaking when he ran out of language that the recording didn't already contradict. Damon had not moved. He was sitting at the end of the table with his hands folded, and the coffee stain on his suit, and the cuff marks on his wrists, and the patience of a man who has been waiting for exactly this moment, for approximately 18 months. Not this specific moment with this specific officer, but the moment when the record speaks for itself, in a room where someone with authority is listening. He spoke once. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at the room. He looked at Lanning directly, and without performance, the way he had been taught to look at witnesses on the stand. The way that communicates that you are not performing attention, but actually paying it. He said, "You were right about one thing, Officer Lanning. Judges do trust the pattern. That's why I spent 3 years building one." The sentence arrived in the silence of the briefing room, the way certain sentences arrive not with volume, but with weight, settling over everything in the room and changing the pressure of it. And what followed it was a silence of a different quality than the silence that had preceded it, deeper and more complete. The silence of a room in which something has been named that was waiting to be named. Lanning looked at him. It was the first time since the diner that he had actually looked at Damon, not cataloged him, not processed him, but looked at him person to person, without the architecture of professional procedure between them. And what crossed Lanning's face in that moment was not remorse exactly, because remorse would have required a more complete understanding of what he had done than he yet possessed, but something adjacent to remorse. Something that looked from the outside like the first small crack in the conviction that he had been right, that the conviction itself might be the thing that had been wrong. Doyle closed his folder. Price looked at the table. Webb exhaled slowly through his nose a long, controlled breath that had been waiting in his chest since the parking lot. Howell uncapped his pen and wrote 4 words on the top of the legal pad in front of him. He did not share what those 4 words were, but he circled them twice. What Howell requested next was not the body camera export or the mobile terminal audit or the diner point-of-sale record. Those were already in hand, already in the chain of custody, already sealed. What he requested was the Raymond Carver file, complete, unredacted, with every booking approval signature and every supervisory sign-off and every complaint review notation visible, in the order it had been added to the file over the 14 months that Raymond Carver had been in county custody. The file arrived in the briefing room from records in 12 minutes, carried by a records officer who set it on the table and left quickly, the way people leave rooms where something significant is happening when they are not part of the significance. Howell read it in order, and what the order revealed was not one mistake, but a structure, a series of decisions made by multiple people across multiple steps, each decision individually defensible in the particular language of procedure, all of them together constituting something that no individual piece of paper read in isolation would have identified as the thing it was. The field note on the Carver stop used the same language as the field notes from the diner possible bulletin: match, refused identification, obstruction of investigation. The bulletin in the Carver case had been received at 11:02 p.m. Lanning's mobile terminal showed it opened at 11:47 p.m., 45 minutes after the stop had been initiated. Price's booking approval signature appeared on page 4 above the notation, Bulletin language verified. He had been at the booking desk for 9 hours when Lanning brought Carver in. He had been processing paperwork since the beginning of the shift. He had trusted the field note because the field note was in the format that field notes were supposed to be in, because the language was familiar, because Lanning was a 17-year veteran, and veterans were trusted, because trusting veterans was faster than verifying source documents. He had not verified the source document. He had trusted the pattern. His name was on the form. The form said something that was not true. And Price sat at the table in the briefing room and looked at his own signature at the bottom of page 4 with the expression of a man confronting something he should have seen a long time ago and did not. The complaint review notation on page 9 showed that a complaint had been filed on the Carver arrest by Carver's mother Denise in the 4th month of his custody, and the notation showed the complaint had been assigned to supervisory review and classified as closed without action, with a handwritten note in the margin, bulletin criteria reviewed and confirmed. The signature below the note was Captain Voss's. Voss had gone pale somewhere around page 6. She was at the table not looking away, which Damon noted because looking away would have been easier, and she was not doing the easier thing. Howell looked at Webb. 6 weeks ago. The traffic stop where you heard the phrase. Was there a booking? No, sir. The driver was released. Lanning said the bulletin match was insufficient. Did you file an observation report? The pause before Webb's answer was very short, but everyone in the room heard it. No, sir. Why not? Webb kept his eyes level. He was my field training supervisor. I had 8 months on the job. I was afraid that filing a report on my own training officer would result in retaliation and potentially end my career before it started. Howell looked at him for a long moment. Fear explains the delay. It doesn't erase it. I know that, sir. You'll be asked to document everything you witnessed in sequence with no omissions, beginning with the traffic stop 6 weeks ago and ending with what happened in this room today. Yes, sir. Your willingness to do that, and to do it completely and truthfully, will be a significant factor in what happens to your career. Webb nodded. He did not ask what would happen if he did it incompletely or untruthfully, because he already knew, and because doing it incompletely or untruthfully was no longer something he was considering. Damon had been quiet for most of this listening, with the specific attention of a man who is both a participant in the process and a witness to it. And when Howell's review of the Carver file reached the complaint on page 9, the complaint filed by Denise Carver in the 4th month, the complaint classified closed without action. He looked at the folder with an expression that was not anger and was not triumph, and was not anything that had a simple name, but was something more like recognition. The recognition of a person who has been trying to build the argument for a thing that already existed, who has been trying to prove that something was happening that was already visible in the file. If anyone looked at the file from the right angle, he thought about Denise Carver filing that complaint. He thought about what it cost her to go to the county building and fill out the form and submit it, and wait, and then be told that the bulletin criteria had been reviewed and confirmed, and what she had done with that information and what it had taken from her to keep going after it. He said, the Raymond Carver case is not the only one. The pattern in those field notes and in that booking language did not begin with Carver, and it did not end with him. When you expand the audit, you will find others. I can name 4 that came through my office in the past 2 years that use identical field note language from the same officer. Howell wrote something on his legal pad. He said, "Give me the names." And Damon, from memory without notes, gave him 4 names in alphabetical order, each with the approximate date and the field note language, and the case outcome, because he had been carrying them the way his father had carried diesel fumes, as evidence that he had been somewhere real, that the work was real, that the names were real, and that they were owed this moment as much as he was. Howell's pen did not stop moving. The findings arrived in writing 2 weeks after the morning at Harlow and Birch Diner, delivered simultaneously to every party under a state preservation notice that meant no one received them before anyone else, and no one had the opportunity to shape the narrative around them before the narrative was already public, and they were written in the plain, unembellished language of official findings that had been made without room for interpretation. Language that said the same thing 3 times in 3 different registers to make certain that no one who read it could claim they had been uncertain about what it meant. Officer Brett Lanning was terminated for cause, not suspended, not given the opportunity to retire under a quiet separation agreement, not permitted to resign in a way that would have allowed him to characterize his departure on his own terms. Terminated for cause with the specific causes named in the termination order in full. The detention was unsupported by observed conduct. The bulletin match was manufactured after the stop was initiated. The arrest record contained materially false statements. The pocketing of the detainee's credential after identity was confirmed by the attending officer constituted deliberate suppression of exculpatory information. His law enforcement certification was revoked by the State Certification Board after an emergency review that took 3 days and required no deliberation, because the body camera export and the mobile terminal audit and the booking record and the parking lot audio together left nothing to deliberate about, and his name was entered into the State Law Enforcement Decertification Index, which was shared with adjacent states, which meant that the career he had built over 17 years in Caldwell County was not transferable to any law enforcement position in the state, or in any state that checked the index, which was every state. A federal civil rights referral was opened under Title 18, Section 242, Deprivation of Rights under Color of Law, and the referral was not a formality. It was a federal investigation with a federal prosecutor assigned and a federal timeline. And what the investigation would find, as it developed over the following months, would be exactly what Damon had told Howell in the briefing room, expressed in the language of federal findings rather than the language of a senator's memory, but saying the same things about the same cases with the same names. State charges followed from the county prosecutor's office. False imprisonment, official misconduct, falsifying a detention record, 3 counts, filed without the option of pre-indictment negotiation, that the county might have offered if the case had involved a less complete evidentiary record, which this case did not. His pension file was flagged for misconduct forfeiture review, which meant the retirement fund he had been building for 17 years, the primary financial planning instrument of a man who had not otherwise saved for the future, because the pension was supposed to be the future, was suspended while the review determined whether the pattern of conduct in his record voided his entitlement to it. The police union filed an emergency grievance. The state reviewed the body camera export and the mobile terminal audit and the diner point-of-sale record in sequence, and then the Raymond Carver file, and then the 4 additional case files Damon had named in the briefing room, and the grievance was rejected in a finding that used the same language as the termination order. The detention was unsupported, the bulletin match was manufactured, the arrest record was false, and a union representing the interests of law enforcement officers could not, in good faith, request reinstatement for a member whose documented conduct represented the specific violation of the principles that law enforcement certification was designed to protect. The last line of the termination order, the line that would be reproduced in every article written about the case, the line that would appear in the law school case summaries that were already being written about the Public Safety Integrity Act, read, "The record reflects not professional judgment applied under pressure, but manufactured suspicion applied in advance of any observed cause." This is the finding that ends the service. Brett Lanning was not there when the findings were delivered. He was at home, which was the next thing that would change. The termination order arrived on a Thursday morning delivered by certified mail, and Brett Lanning was at the kitchen table when it came. Not because he had been waiting for it exactly, but because he had not been sleeping well and had been awake since 4, sitting at the kitchen table with the coffee he made every morning at 5, and now was making at 4, because the extra hour of lying in the dark had stopped being preferable to getting up. And when the letter arrived, he opened it at the table with the coffee going cold beside him. He read it once. Then he read it again. Then he set it down on the table next to the coffee mug and looked at the window and the light coming through it, the pale gray light of a Thursday morning in late October. And he sat with what the letter said for a long time without doing anything with it. The kitchen was the same kitchen it had always been, the same refrigerator with its hum, the same floor tiles he had replaced himself 4 years ago, the same window over the sink where the neighbor's oak tree filled the frame in summer and was bare now, just branches against the gray. And the ordinariness of everything in the kitchen was the most difficult thing. The fact that the kitchen did not know what had happened, that the coffee maker had started automatically at its usual time, that the morning was proceeding in its usual increments around a man whose usual life had just ended. He pulled up his personnel file on his laptop, which he had access to until midnight, when the department system would terminate his credentials, and he read it from the beginning for the first time. All of it, not the way he had read individual sections when he needed to reference something, but from the beginning in order, as a document that told a story about a person. And what the story said was something different from the story he had been telling himself for 17 years. The 11 complaints, the 9 closures, the settlement, the case still in the inactive queue, the field note language appearing and reappearing through the years, the same phrases in the same configurations, the same pattern written clean across 17 years of accumulated decisions that no one had ever required him to account for in a room where the accounting would cost him something. He closed the laptop. Cheryl Lanning came downstairs at 7, which was her usual time, and found him at the table with the letter beside the cold coffee and the laptop closed, and she poured her own coffee and sat down across from him and looked at his face, not at the letter. And she read what was in his face with the attention of a woman who had been reading that face for 22 years, and had been noticing something in it for at least the last 4 that she had not been able to name. She picked up the letter and read it. She set it back down. She drank her coffee. "What happens now?" she said. "Federal charges," he said. "State charges. Pension review." She was quiet for a long time. The neighbor's oak tree moved in the morning wind outside the window. "I've known something was wrong for a while," she said finally. Not as accusation, but as the plainest statement of what was true, delivered in the voice of someone who has been carrying it and is tired of carrying it alone. "I didn't know what it was. I think I didn't want to know." He didn't answer. There was nothing in the script he had been running for 17 years that covered this particular exchange. "I'm going to my sister's," she said. "I need some time to think." She took her coffee upstairs. She came back down 45 minutes later with a bag, and she took the car with the better tires because winter was coming, and she was practical in the ways that mattered, and she did not say when she was coming back, not because she was being cruel, but because she did not know. And Cheryl Lanning had never been willing to promise something she did not know she could keep. The door closed. Lanning sat in the kitchen alone in the silence of a house that had just become a different kind of space, not empty because he was in it, but fundamentally altered the way rooms alter when the person who gave them their particular character is no longer present. And he thought about what the attorney had told him on the phone the previous week before the findings, when the attorney had still been in the position of predicting rather than confirming. The federal referral is serious. Section 242 carries mandatory minimum considerations. You need criminal defense, not union representation. The union defends the badge. You no longer have the badge. He thought about 17 years. He thought about the first morning he had put on the uniform, the weight of the belt, the unfamiliar presence of the badge against his chest, the specific sensation of mattering, of being positioned somewhere definite in the world. And he tried to locate in the 17 years between that morning and this one the exact point where the thing that had given him purpose had become the thing that had eaten him. He could not find it. It had not been a single point. It had been the accumulated permission of a long series of moments in which no one had said stop. The lawn outside the front window was still the same lawn. The oak tree was bare. The morning was proceeding in its usual increments. Brett Lanning sat at his kitchen table and understood for the first time that the world's indifference to what had happened to him was not injustice. It was accuracy. Officer Marcus Webb kept his badge. He kept it because he had done two things that mattered in the accounting that followed. He had preserved the record by returning to the station with Gloria and Frank and the order ticket, and he had testified completely and truthfully in every proceeding that followed from Howell's initial review, through the state monitoring process, through the federal civil rights investigation, without omission and without the softening of inconvenient facts that the blue wall of silence had been built to enable. He also kept his badge because Captain Voss, in her statement to the State Monitoring Committee, said clearly, and without being asked, that Webb's intervention in the booking room had been the action that preserved the evidentiary chain, and that without it, the case against Lanning might have proceeded along an entirely different trajectory, and that this fact did not excuse the delay in the parking lot, but was a material part of the complete record. He still received formal written discipline for the delayed intervention, not as punishment exactly, but as documentation, the formal acknowledgement that the delay had occurred and had mattered, that 6 weeks earlier he had heard a sentence in a parking lot and had not filed an observation report, and that the cost of that silence had been borne by someone else, which was the cost of silence always. He was removed from field training eligibility for 18 months. He was required to complete a procedural ethics review and an independent performance evaluation before he could be considered for any supervisory track. He was reassigned to a different sector of the county, away from the Pinecrest corridor, and away from any assignment that might have brought him back into contact with the cases he had witnessed from the wrong side. He went back to work. He was more careful now. Careful in the specific way of a man who has learned that his silence has weight, that what he chooses not to say travels further than he thought, that the pattern he participates in by staying quiet is the same pattern as the pattern built by the person who speaks. Sergeant Harold Price lost booking approval authority for all obstruction-related arrests pending independent retraining and outside supervisory review of his booking decisions over the previous 3 years. The review would take 8 months. It would find 2 other cases, not Lanning's different officers, different language, similar pattern in which Price had signed booking approvals without verifying source documents. Approvals that had consequences for the people they processed. His written finding said, the sergeant accepted detention narratives without verifying source documentation. This is not the conduct of a corrupt officer. It is the conduct of a compliant one. The distinction matters legally. It does not mitigate the outcome for those who were processed. Price read that sentence 5 times. He was 3 years from retirement, and in those 3 years he read every bulletin, verified every source document, and asked every question he had not been asking for 30 years, because the weight of what it cost people when he didn't had finally, in a briefing room on a Thursday morning in October, become impossible to carry comfortably. Captain Laura Voss lost complaint classification authority. The Oakmont Police Department was placed under state monitoring for 18 months, with quarterly reporting requirements and mandatory external review of all public accommodation stops. And Voss remained at the department and implemented every requirement of the monitoring agreement and did not resign, which was either the decision of a person who had decided that staying and doing the work was more useful than departing, or the decision of a person calculating that leaving would look like an admission, and which of those 2 things it was, only she knew. PBA counsel Martin Doyle received a separate ethics referral after investigators reviewing the call logs from the morning of the diner stop found a call from Doyle's cell phone to Lanning's cell phone, placed at 8:04 a.m., 8 minutes before Howell's arrival, 3 minutes before the preservation order was served. The call lasted 47 seconds. Its contents were not recoverable. The referral did not make Doyle the center of the story. There was enough story without him. but it closed a door he had thought was still open, and the closing of it was noted in the record, in the particular way that closed doors are noted without drama, with permanence. The Caldwell County Police Department was required, as part of the state monitoring agreement, to notify every person arrested by Lanning over the previous 5 years on charges that included bulletin match, profile match, refused identification, or obstruction language, informing them of their right to request an independent case review and providing contact information for the State Public Defender's Supplemental Services Office. The notification went out on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the findings were delivered. By the end of the week, 22 requests for case review had been received. By the end of the month, 37. Each request was a name. Each name was a person who had been in a room similar to the Oakmont booking room, whose field note had been written in the same language, whose story had been shaped by the same 17 years of accumulated, unchallenged permission that had finally met its limit on a Tuesday morning in October, when the wrong person walked into a diner. Not the wrong person in the way Lanning had meant. The wrong person in the way that meant a person who had spent 3 years building exactly the record that this morning would fill. The state review of Raymond Carver's case took 11 days from the moment Howell expanded the audit in the briefing room, which is not a long time in the calendar of legal proceedings, but is a very long time when you are 23 years old and have been in county custody for 14 months, and every day of those 14 months has been a subtraction from the job you had, from the apartment you were paying for, from the relationship you were trying to build, from the version of your life that had been proceeding in an ordinary direction until the night a patrol car's lights came on behind you on a county road, and a field note was written that said things that weren't true in the language of things that were. The review found what Damon had told Howell it would find: no reliable evidence chain. The arrest record relied on bulletin language that had been entered before the bulletin was opened. The booking approval signature appeared above a notation, "Bulletin language verified," that was not supported by the mobile terminal audit, which showed the bulletin had been accessed 45 minutes after the stop. The body camera footage from the night of the Carver stop had been overwritten before the public defender had been able to request it, which was the thing that had made the case hard to crack, and which now, in the context of Lanning's pattern, said something specific and damning about how the retention policy had been applied. The conviction was vacated. The order was processed on a Thursday morning, the same Thursday morning that Lanning received his termination letter, not by design, but by the particular indifferent timing of a legal system that does not coordinate its poetry. Raymond Carver did not know it was coming. He was in his cell when the corrections officer came to the door, and the corrections officer said his name and said he was being released. And Raymond stood at the edge of his bunk for a moment without moving, because in 14 months the word "released" had been in the category of things that happened to other people. Things that he tracked and marked and counted toward, but did not fully allow himself to believe in, because fully believing in things that had not happened yet was a luxury that county custody taught you not to afford. He gathered what he had. There was not much. The watch his father had given him before his father left a Timex that still kept accurate time. $43 in a commissary envelope. A photograph folded in fourths worn at the creases that showed his mother Denise and his younger sister Kezia at his cousin's graduation 2 summers ago. Kezia in a yellow dress, grinning her arm around Denise's waist. The two of them standing in front of a building in the afternoon light. He walked out carrying these things in a plastic property bag. The October air outside the facility was the first thing, the specific quality of outside air which is not the same as any other air, which a person does not fully understand the difference of until they have been without it long enough. And Raymond stood on the concrete apron in front of the release exit and breathed it in and did not move for a moment. Denise Carver had been there since before the gate opened. She was 47 years old, a woman who had raised 2 children on the salary of a medical billing specialist after their father left, who had filed the complaint in the 4th month of Raymond's custody, who had stood in the county building and filled out the form and submitted it and waited and been told the bulletin criteria had been reviewed and confirmed, and who had kept going after that because she was not built for stopping. Because stopping was not a thing her particular combination of love and stubbornness and refusal to accept the unacceptable allowed her to do. She was standing at the edge of the parking lot with her hands pressed flat against the front of her coat, not because she was cold, but because she was holding herself together from the inside. The specific physical management of a person whose body is reacting to something larger than the body can hold without help. And when the release door opened and Raymond came through it, she stayed where she was for a moment, because the distance between where she was standing and where he was standing was the distance between 14 months of not knowing and right now, and crossing it was not something her legs did immediately. Raymond saw her. He stopped on the concrete apron. Then he walked across the parking lot, and she walked across the parking lot, and they met in the middle, and she put her arms around him, and he put his arms around her, and they stood there in the October morning while the parking lot did its ordinary business around them, cars moving in and out, other people coming and going, the world continuing its usual motion around two people who were not moving. He held the photograph in one hand while she held him the photograph of her and Kezia in the afternoon light, which he had looked at every day for 14 months as evidence that the world outside the walls had continued, that the people in it had continued, that he would eventually be in it again. And when he finally pulled back enough to look at her face, what he saw there was everything the 14 months had cost her, which was not on the surface, but was present underneath it, in the particular way a person looks when they have been carrying something for a long time and have just been allowed to set it down. They sat in her car for 20 minutes before she started the engine. The heat came on. The October sky outside the windshield was the pale blue of a morning that has not yet decided what kind of day it will be. "Kezia," he said. "She's good," Denise said. "She started at Caldwell Community in September. She is very good." He looked at the photograph. "She said she would." "She did. She said it the whole time you were in." They drove. The highway unspooled south toward Fairfield Flats, through the middle of the county that had never had a story attached to it, through the north that had always had the wrong kind of story, and then south and east toward the part of the county that was his, that had always been his, that the field note had tried to make into something other than his. And he watched it pass through the car window the way you watch things when you are seeing them again for the first time, with the specific attention of a person reclaiming what was taken. Denise reached across the center console and covered his hand with hers briefly, without comment, the gesture of a mother who has learned not to say everything she is feeling because some things are too large for the inside of a car. And then she put her hand back on the wheel. They did not talk about the case. They did not talk about Lanning or the findings or the vacated conviction or any of the legal architecture that had eventually produced this morning. Those were conversations for later, for rooms where they could spread the documents on a table and go through them with the deliberate attention they deserved. Right now, there was only this: the highway, the morning, the heat in the car, the two of them going in the same direction. Raymond folded the photograph back into its 4 quarters. He put it in his jacket pocket where it had lived for 14 months, and he thought about Kezia starting at Caldwell Community in September, about the yellow dress in the photograph, about the 2 summers of time between the graduation and this morning, and what those 2 years had contained for each of them, and what they would contain from here. He thought about the senator he had never met, who had stood in a briefing room and named him to an attorney general and given him 4 cases in alphabetical order from memory, as if carrying those names was a thing you did automatically when you understood their weight. He did not know the senator's name. He would not learn it for another 3 weeks, when the letter from the State Public Defender's Supplemental Services Office arrived at his mother's address, explaining the review and the vacated conviction, and the rights he now had, and the contact information for organizations that could help him navigate what came next. He would read the letter twice before he set it down. He would fold it carefully and put it in the drawer of his mother's kitchen table next to the lease he had been saving for when he got out, which was still there because Denise had been the kind of mother who keeps things. But that was 3 weeks away. Right now he was in the car going home, his mother's hand on the wheel, the October sky pale and wide above the highway. The window cracked an inch because he wanted the air, the particular outside air that was not the same as any other air, coming in against his face as the county moved past at highway speed. He closed his eyes. He was thinking about the drive, just the drive. 6 months after the morning at Harlow and Birch Diner, the Public Safety Integrity Act came to a full Judiciary Committee vote, and the room it came to was the same room where Damon had been presenting legislation for 3 years, the same long table and the same water pitchers and the same portrait of a former governor on the wall whose expression managed to be both pompous and vacant. And the light through the high windows was the particular winter light of a February afternoon, low and blue and very clear. Damon did not make the case for the bill in the language of what had happened to him. He made it in the language of what the bill did, what it required, what it made impossible that had previously been possible. Because the bill was not about him. It had never been about him. Not even on the morning when his own wrists were the ones with the marks on them, and he was aware that turning it into his story would be a reduction, a narrowing of something that was built from many stories into something that was only as wide as one. He described the bill in plain language, the kind of language that the 45-year-old logistics worker and the 62-year-old retired teacher who watched committee proceedings on the state government channel could follow without needing a law degree. An officer could not cite a bulletin match in a field note unless the bulletin had been opened, its criteria acknowledged, and the attachment logged before detention was initiated. Not after, before, with a timestamp to prove it. Body cameras would lock automatically when restraints were applied. When an officer keyed certain language into a field note, or when a stop occurred in any public accommodation, creating an automatic preservation trigger that did not depend on anyone's memory or good faith. Booking could not process obstruction as a standalone charge without an underlying offense, and a supervisor checklist that required an independent verification of the source document. Any field note using profile language or bulletin match language was required to name a specific, articulable, observed fact. Not a feeling, not a location, not a vehicle type, not a face that looked out of place to someone who had already decided what out of place looked like, but a fact. He said these things the way a contractor describes the specifications of a foundation, not with passion, not with anger, not with the performance of righteousness that legislative chambers sometimes reward, but with the flat, certain authority of someone who has done the work and knows what the work produces. The vote passed. Not unanimously, 3 members voted no, which was not surprising, which was in fact the expected resistance of people whose objections had been heard and incorporated where they could be incorporated, and overruled where they couldn't. And the non-unanimity was its own kind of honesty, the acknowledgement that the bill was not a reconciliation, but a correction, and corrections always have people who preferred what was being corrected. When the gavel came down, Damon sat for a moment without moving. Then he folded the clean copy of the bill once and placed it in his briefcase, and beside it, in the same briefcase, sealed in the evidence sleeve that Gloria had put it in 6 months ago, was the coffee-stained draft from Harlow and Birch Diner, the one with the blue ink notes and the circled line and the coffee stain that had spread across the circled line on a Tuesday morning in October, while a body camera recorded everything. He had carried that draft to every committee session, every amendment discussion, every procedural negotiation, every meeting where someone had asked him to explain why this bill was different from the previous attempts that had stalled or failed or been amended into something too narrow to do the work it needed to do. He had not shown it to anyone. He had not referenced it in any speech. It was not a prop. It was a reminder of the weight of what he was asking the law to carry, of the people whose names he had given to Howell in alphabetical order from memory, of Raymond Carver in the back of his mother's car with the window cracked an inch. The archive file at the State Records Office would hold both documents. The clean copy with the governor's signature and the effective date, and the coffee-stained draft with the evidence sleeve and the body camera export certificate clipped to the back. Together they told the story of what the law had cost before it existed and what it would now be able to prevent. The stains stayed on the paper. The law no longer required anyone to pay them. The law took effect 90 days after the governor signed it, and in the first month, under the new requirements, 14 stops in public accommodations across the state triggered the automatic body camera preservation protocol. 14 moments that, under the old rules, would have been processed and overwritten and absorbed into the filing system without independent review, and that, under the new rules, became documented, time-stamped records that could be examined in sequence by someone who had not been present when they occurred. 6 of those 14 triggered supervisory reviews. 3 of those reviews resulted in findings that changed the outcomes of the cases involved. The law was working. It was working because the work had been done correctly, because the sequence had been preserved, because a man in a corner booth had decided that the record mattered more than the convenience of ending things quickly. And the record was now, for the first time, legally required to exist. Brett Lanning's federal trial date was set for the following spring. His house went on the market in February, listed at a price that reflected the speed of necessity rather than the patience of preference, and it sold in 3 weeks to a young couple from the north side of the county, who were not aware of its history and would not have known where to find it if they had been looking. Cheryl did not come back from her sister's. She filed the paperwork in January with a family law attorney in the next county, and the process was quiet and complete, and she moved forward with the particular efficiency of a woman who had made her decision and did not revisit decisions once they were made. The lawn outside the house grew longer than it ever had when Lanning was the man who kept it right, and then the new owners moved in, and the lawn became theirs. Raymond Carver was hired at a logistics company run by a man named Daniel Osai, who had read the vacated conviction order in the county paper and made a call to a mutual contact who had made a call to Denise, who had given Raymond the number. Raymond started on a Monday. He was good at the work, organized, reliable, the kind of worker who tracked sequences and remembered details, which was a skill he had developed over 14 months of having nothing to do but pay attention. And by the 3rd week, he was running the morning inventory process without being asked. His younger sister, Kezia, sent him a photograph of herself in front of the Caldwell Community Admissions Building on the first day of her 2nd semester, grinning in the same way she had been grinning in the graduation photograph, which was the grin of someone who had decided to be exactly where they were. He put it on his desk at work, next to the commissary envelope with $43 in it that he had brought home from the release exit and had not spent because he was not yet sure what it should be spent on, but he was keeping it the way you keep things that mark where a particular road began. The State Monitoring Committee convened its first public accountability hearing 4 months after the findings were issued, and among the witnesses called was Gloria Reyes, who received the notification at the diner on a Wednesday morning and read it twice before she folded it and put it in the pocket of her apron and told Frank she would need a Tuesday off. She arrived at the committee room in her good cardigan, the gray one she kept for occasions that required something better than her work clothes and something less formal than the things she did not own. And she sat at the witness table with her hands folded in front of her and answered every question directly and without elaboration, in the manner of a person who has decided that the truth is sufficient and does not require decoration. They asked her to describe the morning of the stop. She described it in sequence: the customers, the light, Damon at the corner booth, Lanning at the counter, the approach, the coffee spill, the handcuffs, the walk through the diner to the door. She did not characterize, she described. They asked her, "Why did you record?" She looked at the questioner with the patient attention of a person who has been asked to explain something that seems obvious to her and is trying to find the version that will be useful to the person asking. "Because I have seen it happen before, and nobody had anything to show," she said. "The first time I saw it happen, the man who was taken had been sitting at the same booth. Different man, same booth, same morning. That was 11 years ago. I didn't have my phone out then. I have thought about that every time I worked the Tuesday morning shift since." They asked her, "Why did you keep the receipt?" "Because he paid for something he didn't get to finish," she said. "And in 19 years, that receipt is the one piece of paper I have kept that mattered. I kept it because it seemed like the kind of thing that would matter later. It was the kind of thing that would matter later." They asked her if she had any statement she wanted to make to the committee. She thought for a moment. Then she said, "I want you to understand that I am not unusual. I am a waitress who has been working in the same diner for 19 years. I did not do anything that required special training or special courage. I kept a receipt, and I held up my phone. What is unusual is that this time it mattered. What I would like you to consider is what it means that the same morning has happened in that diner before, and the receipt from that morning is nowhere in any file. She did not wait for a response. She had said what she came to say. She drove back to Harlow and Birch Diner on the county road, parked in the lot, went through the back entrance, tied on her apron, and opened the Wednesday morning shift. She set up the booth by the window with the place setting she always used. Coffee cup at the left, napkin folded under the fork, salt and pepper squared to the edge of the table, and she turned the sign on the door to open, and the morning began. She did not receive an award. She had not expected one. What she received was a letter from the State Monitoring Committee 3 weeks later thanking her for her testimony and informing her that her account had been entered into the official record of the hearing, and she put the letter in the same drawer where she kept the other things she did not throw away. The photograph of her mother, the medal her brother had won in a county track competition in 1987, the first paycheck stub from Harlow and Birch, which she had kept for no reason she could explain, except that it marked where something had started. That was enough. That was the right kind of enough. It was a Tuesday morning in May, and the light through the east-facing windows of Harlow and Birch Diner was the particular light of late spring. Not the golden October light that had been there the first time, but its own version of good, higher in the sky, now softer. The kind of light that arrives with warmth rather than announcing it. The kind of light that feels, after a winter of its absence, like a thing that was always coming back. Damon parked the same car at the same curb. He had not planned to stop here, or rather, he had planned it in the way that you plan things that you do not admit you are planning. The way certain decisions make themselves while you are looking somewhere else, so that by the time you park at the curb, the decision is already done and you are simply catching up to it. He walked in. The bell above the door made the same sound it had always made. Gloria looked up from the coffee station, and what passed between them in that look was not a performance and was not a commemoration. It was the particular acknowledgement of two people who were present on the same significant morning and are now both present on this one, which is its own kind of thing, quieter and more durable than drama. She did not say anything. She went behind the counter and came back with the coffee pot and set his cup down in the corner booth, the same booth before he had finished taking off his coat. He sat down. He looked at the booth, at the table, the window, the morning light on the vinyl, and he noticed for the first time, or for the first time in the way of truly noticing, a small laminated card mounted on the wall near the register, printed by the county, in the Public Accommodation Notification format required by the Public Safety Integrity Act, that had taken effect 2 months ago. It was 2 sentences, plain language. The rights a person had in a public accommodation during any law enforcement contact, and a number to call. He read it from across the room. Then he looked away because reading it was sufficient, and lingering on it would be the wrong kind of self-congratulation, the kind that loses track of what the thing is actually for. Gloria was refilling the coffee she had just poured, which was not necessary, but was the way she expressed things that she did not have words for in this particular context, and he watched her do it, and thought about the morning in October when she had stood at the coffee station with the towel against her chest and watched him be walked out of her diner, and what that had cost her. What it costs a person to watch something and be unable to stop it, and then to do the one thing that was in their power to do, to keep the receipt and hold up the phone and drive to the station before anyone asked. The diner looked the same, the retired couple at the center table, the construction worker at the counter, the smell of bacon and the fluorescent warmth underneath the window light. And what was different about it was nothing you could point to and name. It was a difference in atmosphere rather than arrangement, a difference in what the space meant to the people in it, which was not visible but was present. Outside the front window, the spot at the curb where Lanning's cruiser had pulled up in October was empty. A pickup truck was parked there now, belonging to the construction worker at the counter with out-of-county plates and a dented rear bumper and a coffee thermos visible through the passenger window. Nobody was watching it. Nobody was watching the construction worker. He was eating his breakfast in the comfortable invisibility of a man whose presence required no accounting, and what was remarkable about this was that it was not remarkable at all that it was simply how Tuesday mornings were supposed to work, that this was not an achievement but a baseline, and the work of the past 6 months had been the work of moving a baseline back to where it was supposed to be. Damon looked at the empty curb for a moment. Then he opened his briefcase. The new draft was called the Community Evidence Preservation Act, and what it proposed to extend the automatic body camera preservation requirement to covered additional categories of public contact officers, school resource officers, municipal housing inspectors, county welfare compliance officers, the people who moved through communities with the authority of the state behind them and the documentation requirements of the previous era in front of them, which is to say, requirements that assumed good faith and did not verify it. He spread the pages on the table beside the coffee. The draft was already marked up. He had been working on it in the car on the way to meetings, on the corners of notepads during committee hearings, in the margins of the budget documents that committee chairmanship required him to read. And the draft showed this, the way all working documents show it, with the layered handwriting of ideas arriving at different times and being absorbed into the structure wherever they fit. He uncapped his pen. He thought about his father, Raymond Carter, who had driven long-haul freight until his knees gave out and had sat at kitchen tables reading newspapers with the focused attention of someone studying for a test, who had said, "You will be stopped. You decide what you do while you're standing still." Not as inspiration, not as a motivational principle, but as a practical description of the world as it actually was, and the only useful response to it. He thought about October, about the 4 seconds in the booth when the credential was 8 inches from his hand, and he did not reach for it. And he thought about whether Raymond Carter would have called that the right decision, would have recognized it as the thing the lesson was pointing toward, and he thought yes. Not because it had felt right in the moment, it had felt like cold metal on his wrists and coffee spreading across 18 months of work, but because Raymond Carver had walked out of a county facility on a Thursday morning, and because the law that had made the vacated conviction possible had begun in those 4 seconds in the decision to let the sequence be complete. He thought about the next person. He always thought about the next person. The person who would benefit from the Community Evidence Preservation Act if it passed the school resource officer, who would hesitate before a stop that, under the new requirements, would be documented automatically. The 18-year-old in a hallway who would be covered by a protection that had not existed before. And he thought about what it meant that the next person was always a person he had not met, whose name he did not know, whose face he could not picture, and for whom the work was nevertheless real and specific, and worth the effort of sitting in a corner booth on a Tuesday morning in May with a marked-up draft and a good cup of coffee. He thought about Kezia Carver in the photograph from the admissions building, grinning in the morning light with the confidence of someone who had decided to be exactly where she was. He thought about what it had cost Raymond to be gone for those 2 years, the 2 years of Kezia's grin, the ordinary forward motion of a life. And he thought about what the law that was now in effect would have done for Raymond if it had existed on the night the lights came on behind his car on the county road. If the bulletin had needed to be attached before the stop, if the body camera had locked automatically when the cuffs were applied, if the booking desk had needed a verified source document before processing the obstruction charge. He thought it would have been enough. The law, correctly applied, would have been enough. And then he thought, building it to be enough is the work. The work is not finished. It is not finished for the school resource officer, or the housing inspector, or the next category that the next version of this bill will cover. And it will not be finished until the gap between what the law says and what the law does has been closed in enough places that it is no longer the primary operating strategy of every person from Fairfield Flats who drives home from work after dark. He uncapped his pen. He drew a circle around a line on the draft. Then he reached for the coffee and leaned back against the booth and looked out the window at the May morning. The street, the parked cars, the light, the ordinary Tuesday motion of a county going about its business. And what he felt was not contentment exactly, not satisfaction, not the sense of completion that people sometimes expect to feel after a long effort has produced a result, but something more like orientation, the sense of knowing where north is, of knowing which direction the work continues in. That was enough. It was the right kind of enough. A Caldwell County Sheriff's Department vehicle made the turn off the county road and moved slowly along the front of Harlow and Birch Diner at 7:41 in the morning, which was a routine patrol pass on this block on Tuesday mornings, and the deputy behind the wheel, young, still careful, 2 months into his first posting under the new department, monitoring requirements, glanced at the diner's front window as he passed. At the parked cars along the curb at the ordinary business of a Tuesday morning arranging itself in the early light. He did not pull into the lot. He did not slow to a stop and watch through the window. He did not read the Capital District plates on the luxury sedan and perform whatever calculation that observation might have prompted under the previous arrangement of the world. He looked, he noted, he continued, which was the entirety of what a patrol pass was supposed to be. No more, no less, just a presence moving through the street as evidence that someone was paying attention in the right direction. Damon watched the cruiser pass from the corner booth through the east-facing window with the distracted peripheral attention of a man who is doing something else and notices a thing in passing without making it into more than it is. The cruiser rounded the corner at the end of the block and disappeared, and the street settled back into its Tuesday arrangement. The pickup truck at the curb, the light on the pavement, the ordinary forward motion of a morning that was not asking anyone to account for themselves. He looked back at the draft. Gloria came around the counter with the coffee pot. She did not ask if he wanted more. She had not asked for 19 years. She simply poured the way she did for everyone she had decided belonged here, which was a category she had been managing on her own terms for 19 years without a written policy or a state mandate. And Damon looked up from the draft when he felt the warmth of the fresh coffee and found her standing at the edge of the booth with the pot in her hand, and an expression that was not quite a smile but was in the same neighborhood. She said cherry pie today. He said yes, thank you, and the smile came the rest of the way. Not because anything was resolved, the work was not resolved. The next draft was on the table with its circled lines and its margin notes, and its careful architecture of the next step in a sequence that did not have a last step. And not because everything was fixed, because everything was not fixed, and both of them knew it. But because a man was sitting in the corner booth at 7:41 in the morning on a Tuesday in May, drinking his coffee, working on the next thing, and nobody was watching him like he needed to explain why he was there, and that the simple, hard-won, still fragile fact of that was something. It was proof of something. Gloria went back behind the counter and Damon looked down at the draft and drew a second circle around the same line he had already circled a second ring around the thing that needed to be there. The specific protection that the next person would need before any of the rest of it could matter. And the circle was smaller than the first one, drawn more carefully, the pen moving with the particular attention of a man who knows that the thing he is circling is the thing the next 14 months will be built around, and the 14 months after that, and however many months it takes until the circle is a law, and the law is enough. And the next person does not need the law, because the thing the law is designed to prevent has stopped happening. He was not there yet. He knew he was not there yet. But he knew where north was, and he had good coffee, and the May light was coming through the east window at the angle that late spring mornings have softer than October, warmer the angle of a morning that is moving towards something rather than away from it. The bell above the door rang. Someone came in. Damon did not look up. He was already writing. If this story moved something in you, if you've ever been made to feel like you needed to explain yourself in a place where you simply belonged, we'd love to hear from you in the comments below. And if you believe that stories like this one matter, please subscribe to our channel and share this video. The next story is already coming, and it is worth your time. This is a work of original fiction, created to explore themes of accountability, civil rights, and institutional reform. All characters, events, and institutions depicted are entirely fictional.